So sometimes I look at processed food, a particular item is not being bad in and of itself, but bad because it fills up my stomach and distracts me, there's that word again, from eating better for me things.
Team, welcome back to another week with Drew and Alex on the Mops and Mo's podcast. Before we kick things off, normally we go back and forth about random nonsense, but for people that don't know, Mops and Mo's has been growing.
We're about to pitch our primary sponsor. We're going to tell you all about them.
Yep, we got a sponsor.
They are us.
The sponsor is us. We sponsor ourselves. A couple of things there. I know for people who may or may not know, Long and Strong, our ongoing virtual training platform. If anybody is curious about how to get bigger, faster, stronger, if anybody out there wants to look good naked, especially with bikini season upcoming, and I mean that for both men and women, head to the website, mopsandmos.com. You'll see the training tab. You can sign up. We also obviously have the blog where we've been putting out a lot more information and likely a lot more to come as pertains to the current situation going on, both with cuts to H2F and embedded human performance, additions to H2F and embedded human performance, changes to PT tests. A big one, though, that we do want to talk about is our new Discord server, which we're sort of jokingly but also officially calling Leg Tuck Nation. For our Long and Strong folks and for the folks that we have that are engaged in our Strava platform, we've put out a link to make that Discord server free for a particular period of time, but moving forward, that's going to be something that you can opt into. We'll have a sort of small subscription fee that will go with that. But our hope with Discord, for folks that don't know what that is to effectively create an online platform for communication, discussion, release of information. We're looking to have some of our heavy-hitting podcast guests on there as well to engage with people if they have questions about the episodes, job postings, things in the industry that we think will be relevant. So again, the goal is just to have that be an absolute goldmine of both content and information. So be on the lookout for that. But I just want to give a really big shout out to Mops and Mo's for sponsoring this episode. We really appreciate all the work that those guys do.
They're not super generous, so they don't pay us a lot for the sponsorship. So we got to wrap this thing up pretty quickly. But two other quick ones. We do have some rehab and injury prevention content also on the training portion of our website if you want to check that out. And we do have a merch store under the shop section where you can get some Zone 2 and Leg Tuck Nation swag. Boop. With the sponsorship stuff knocked out, that brings us to definitely one of the guests I've been most excited to have on the show. Certainly one that's like way beyond what we're qualified to have on our platform.
Yeah. When you're researching for show guests and you're listening to like the Joe Rogans and the Dax Shepherds and they have no business.
The Daily Show.
Daily Show.
Yeah, he's done some stuff. So our guest this week is Michael Moss. He is the author of the #1 New York Times best-selling Salt, Sugar, Fat that rocked the processed food industry. It's actually been so impactful that it's still in print a decade later and now in 22 languages. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I think our first Pulitzer Prize winner on the podcast. Formerly with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He's a trusted keynote speaker to global audiences. And his latest best-selling book, Hooked, explores addiction and free will in battle with corporate interests. He's been a guest on shows like CBS This Morning, CNN The Lead, All Things Considered, and The Daily Show to discuss his work, which has ranged widely from exposing corporate interests in nursing homes to the Pentagon's failure to provide appropriate body armor to soldiers in combat, to the food industry in the context of health, safety, nutrition, politics, marketing, and the power of individuals to gain control of what and how they eat. You can kind of guess from the level of emphasis, but we'll be pretty focused on that processed food component of the whole discussion here. He lives with his wife, Eve, in Brooklyn, where they've raised 2 boys.
And anybody that's listened to Alex and I talk for any period of time will know that our sort of big 3, if you will, are obviously fitness, crazy policy decisions, and absolutely annihilating the processed food industry. The hill, at least that I want to die on, as folks know, is fast food on military installations. So conversations like these are always super fun, especially because what Michael did in his book and what we talk about here, it kind of leads towards conversations around like intentional manipulation of nutritional properties to like, maybe push back a little bit on the conversation around whether or not obesity is a disease. Do we have a choice in these matters, or is it truly like quote unquote evil geniuses making things difficult for us? I mean, this is the book that talks about all of that. And you mentioned Hooked, his other book. I mean, this one gets after something that you and I have talked about, which is sort of choice architecture. And I know we had the former Sergeant Major of the Army on, and he was not necessarily against fast food on military bases because, like he said, soldiers should be able to make the right choice. Well, interestingly enough, sometimes it's better to create a good food architecture, a choice architecture to push people to make the right decisions about food. And all of that is kind of explored here. So I love these conversations. I know some folks wonder why we're not talking about bench pressing, but like this is so interesting to me.
And a couple of quick shout outs. The show notes will include links to both of the books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked. Highly recommend them. Available paperback, Kindle, Audible, whatever. But if you're not feeling the need to read the entire books, there is a article version of the first one on New York Times. So like a much shorter, easier to digest, quickie version. I will include that link in the show notes as well. And just to kind of warm you guys up for some themes of this conversation, I don't know exactly how long it'll be between this conversation happening now and when this episode publishes. But I believe yesterday in the timeline of this conversation, RFK Jr. announced some action by the Food and Drug Administration related to artificial food dyes. I said some action because people who listen closely will notice that they didn't actually ban anything. He just had a meeting with some people and talked about some stuff. But I think a thesis that I buy into that you will hear echoes of in this conversation is that those things are largely distractions. Mm-hmm. And the industry is smart enough to keep people mad about or excited about distractions while the things that actually matter go on quietly in the background. And we're going to try and get into those things that actually matter here.
For sure. So grab a healthy snack, sit back, enjoy this week's conversation with Michael Moss. I want to hear your story about food on military bases.
Well, I actually had two experiences in my sort of trips to Iraq during the war. The first one, I was in northern Iraq in Erbil, and kind of it was quiet up there, so I was on my own doing some reporting, and I had some kebabs in a street market and got violently ill, which became kind of a security concern because I was staying in kind of a dodgy hotel and felt incredibly vulnerable, sitting on the toilet and trying to like, blockade the door and as my security item. But then the second one was in Camp Fallujah, where, the issue wasn't pathogens, but for people who depend on their physical, well-being as a matter of life and death. I found the mess hall food to be incredibly unhealthy. I mean, it was so fried and heavy with grease that I have to say I had the worst gas that I've ever had in my life. And maybe some of that was from, the tension too of just kind of being in a war zone, but a lot of it had to do with the food, and I was really kind of just taken aback by that because that was kind of my first experience. But really, it's the MREs that I think that really kind of grabbed my attention because in reporting for the first book I wrote on the processed food industry, I came across this kind of incredible story of kind of the evolution of MREs. And it has to do with this legend in the processed food industry named Howard Moskowitz, who was trained at high math at Queens College and then experimental psychology at Harvard. And when he graduated from Harvard, he looked around and he got a job with Natick, nearby in Massachusetts, and they were trying to like resuscitate the MRE of those days, which was basically, the challenge was they had this thing that tasted like cardboard because it had to sit on the shelf for 5 years. And Howard's job was to try to come up with something a little tastier for soldiers because soldiers in the field, their problem wasn't overeating, it was undereating and being, having their appetite. And Howard did kind of some experiments that later became hugely critical to the success of the processed food industry because he went to work for the biggest food companies in America. And they had the same problem as the military, basically having these basic food products that because of the necessity of needing a long shelf life and other things, low cost, etc., tasted like cardboard until Howard came along and invented what he called the bliss point
Hmm.
to maximize the amount of sweetness in these products. And, the food industry was often running with what we now see as, one of the biggest man-made, health problems of our times that has come back to kind of bite the military in some sort of
Yeah.
awful ways.
So I was curious because I think where we go with this conversation will likely go away from the military for a while. But I appreciate that you brought up Howard Moskowitz because as I was reading your book or both of your books, there were a bunch of surprising military connections that I was not necessarily aware of. For people listening, Howard Moskowitz, the stuff he went on to be involved in is like Dr. Pepper, Campbell's Soup, Kraft, like he made pizzas, all sorts of
Some
things.
small
He's
brands you may have
been
heard of.
everywhere in processed food. The other ones that stood out to me, Al Clossie, he was Jello, instant pudding, Tang, Cool Whip, stovetop stuffing, all of these things. He got a chemistry degree and put it to work at an explosives plant and then served in the Navy in World War II.
Right. Well, like so many people were there, yeah, veterans, World War II. Yeah, yeah.
And the last one I was aware of, maybe I missed others in your book. I don't know if you know more than I do here, but Gene Mayer,
Yeah.
in his career, famous for nutrition advocacy at Tufts University, but he served in the French artillery in World War II. He was at Dunkirk. He fled occupied France, made his way to the US, and then ultimately went back once Charles de Gaulle formed the Free French Forces. Just some really surprising, like Gene Mayer's a name I'd heard of in the nutrition space. I wasn't aware of his whole military history. I'm curious, you mentioned the military's role in processed food and the fact that it's come back to bite us decades later. Are there any other military connections that you've run into in the course of all this reporting?
Yeah, there was a dentist. So, before the 1990, you pick up a box of convenient packaged food and you kind of had no idea what was in it because the industry was not required to even list ingredients and certainly not to kind of parse the nutrient value of them. Um, and a dentist working for the Veterans Administration, I want to say Texas, and I could go to my shelf and pull his book if you want to know his name, but you can probably just look him up with these words. He realized that, one of the biggest reasons why he was getting so many patients in was none other than breakfast cereals, which he suspected, had more sugar than candy. And he began testing the sugars, the cereals, and he published a book that actually for the first time documented the huge amounts of sugar, not only in cereal, but in many of the products in the grocery store. So he may have been kind of more important than everybody in terms of awakening civilians, and not to mention military personnel to the high sugar content of processed foods.
And that kind of led to Gene Mayer's advocacy later, right? That was tied together, I think.
Yeah, I think Gene was the guy who sort of said who compared, sugary cereals to being sort of like, sugar-coated vitamin, pills or what have you, sort of again. Because one of the things the cereal industry did to distract us from the amounts of sugar in their products, and that's so much the playbook of this industry, which is to get us not to kind of focus on the real issues at hand. One of the things they did was add lots of vitamins and minerals to sugary cereal in hopes that we would see them as being healthful and not harmful.
Do you think, like, and maybe this gets into some of the history of processed foods, and we've had folks on before, Dr. Mozafarian as an example. I don't know, Alex, I wouldn't say that he was like an advocate of processed foods, but he made the claim as to why they served a role maybe post World War II and that sort of stuff. But historically, was there a time when like we were kind of like okay with this sort of thing and then realized it was bad for us, or have they gone hand in hand since the beginning? We realized this wasn't good for us, and we've just been fighting that fight tooth and nail ever since.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few kind of milestones that you can kind of trace the rise of the processed food industry. One goes all the way back to, the early 1900s when a physician named Dr. Kellogg, later to be the Kellogg Company, was treating patients at a sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and hated sugar, was giving them this kind of sugarless, menu, and he went on a trip, and his little brother Will decided they could make a lot more money by dumping some sugar into the granola they were and it people went crazy for it. So that was the birth of kind of the sugary cereal era. But in terms of kind of our reliance on processed foods, not just for breakfast, but for lunch and for dinner. One of the biggest moments was a social moment when, in the 60s, when more and more women began working outside of the home, and fewer men raised their hand to say, "Hey, don't worry, I'll chip in and help with dinner." And that's when the processed food industry sort of coined the term convenience foods and basically said to America, don't worry, we'll take care of dinner for you as well as lunch, as well as breakfast. And you have to give them that because that convenience allowed one half of the household, certainly, if not both halves, to on the adult side to spend more time doing other things, in this case, working or what have you. But there was this huge hidden cost
Mm.
to that convenience in terms of the lack of nutritional value or the plethora of nutritionally harmful aspects of the processed food products that they were getting us to fall for so hard.
So I don't want to miss an opportunity here. Michael did a brief treatment of the John Harvey Kellogg, Will Kellogg story. And if you listen to this podcast and this stuff remotely interests you, I highly recommend going to the book to get the full version of it. But it's kind of a brilliant, I guess, symbol of like capitalism versus our best health intentions because it was founded as a health retreat, a health resort. It was very successful in that role. It had a hospital, a nursing school, a gym, a garden, it built with all the right like holistic health ideas in mind, and it was well regarded worldwide for that under John Harvey's leadership. And the shredded wheat cereal was sort of like not the important part of the whole thing. It was just a product that helped achieve like the low fat aims that he had for the diets for the people. It's the time when we're talking about different health concerns, high fat diets being one of the things. Um, but Will Kellogg, his brother, comes in and is much more business minded. John Harvey's all health minded and jumping around from idea to idea and getting distracted. And like you said, John leaves for a few weeks to go to Europe to learn about medical science. Will finds out shredded wheat cereal is way better with a bunch of sugar added to it. Fast
Mhm.
forward to 1922, two court battles later, you have Kellogg's, and it is not in control of the guy who cared about health. It's in control of the guy who cared about business. And it's just that phenomenon seems to play out a lot in the stories you've surfaced.
Yeah, it's a pretty fabulous story, and you're right. It does kind of reflect this underlying ethos in the processed food industry, which again comes back in the secret 1999 industry meeting that I uncovered and wrote about, where a cabal of insiders is pleading with the heads of the largest food companies to acknowledge their culpability in their products, causing not just obesity, but several types of other chronic diseases and several types of cancers, and pleading with the executives to try to, turn it around and do something on behalf of consumers. And the response from the executives was very harshly that while they might be concerned with consumer health, they're also beholden to investors, and that there was nothing they were going to do that would, diminish the allure of their products because they would be doing a disservice to those investors the companies and to Wall Street. And that pretty much remains the ethos of the industry today. Because look, I mean, I usually try to say that, I don't see this industry as this evil empire that intentionally set out to make so many of us sick in so many ways. These are companies doing what most companies want to do, which is to sell as much product as possible by making that product as attractive as possible. And it may be too much to expect them to act like philanthropies, even knowing the damage that their products are causing.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because I've wanted to ask you this question ever since I've started reading your first book. And it's a big question, so go wherever you want with this. But we have had folks come on here, and this is part of the national conversation right now, obesity being a disease. Is it a disease? Is it not a disease? One of my questions for you around that is, would you consider obesity to be a disease or a byproduct of the disease of addiction that these companies seem to sort of intentionally create?
Ooh, yeah, the disease thing it's really tricky because, it kind of depends where you're coming from. And there are certainly some physicians and researchers and policymakers who want to think of it as a disease because it enables them to kind of treat it in a way that otherwise maybe they couldn't. The addiction thing. So salt, sugar, fat came out, and I tried to end on a positive note, being a journalist that, information is power and knowing all these tricks the companies are up to, can hopefully enable us to make better decisions about what to eat and how much and how much to eat. And the very first question I got out of the gate, this is from like a British TV group, was, well, Michael, but isn't the stuff you're writing about addictive? And if so, like, how can we have any say in the matter of how much we eat? And I was really kind of taken aback because to me, the word addiction seemed too harsh. I mean,
Mhm.
comparing Twinkies to heroin seemed kind of ludicrous, actually. So I actually spent a couple more years, researching and writing the second book, looking at that question, are these products so powerful that we should, maybe consider them to be addictive? And I came full circle in now thinking that not only, I mean, it's not only can they be as trouble as, cigarettes and alcohol and even some harsher drugs for some people, but in some ways, they're even more problematic for us because the companies have figured out how to kind of tap into and exploit our basic instincts that attract us to food. And they've so dramatically changed the food environment in the last 50 years, that's made overeating an everyday thing. And so again, in many ways, I think these food products are even more trouble than other substances that we now accept are addictive or can be addictive, like cigarettes.
Just to highlight a couple things, because I was surprised by some of the findings in Hooked. Uh, One, sugar sends signals to your brain many times faster than something like cocaine because it doesn't have to wait for it to
Point
go into
eight
the
seconds
bloodstream
or
to get
something like
there.
that.
And
Yeah,
then,
or cigarette smoke too. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And then one really stood out to me. You spent a little bit of time discussing the research by psychologists who looked at like essentially subliminal messaging, like quick flashes of scenes that would trigger a drug addict into like a craving state. And then the question was, would similar subliminal messages affect somebody who is quote unquote addicted to food, who has a problem with overeating? And the response was telling because you wouldn't need subliminal messaging. We live in America. People who have a problem with processed food or fast food are surrounded by those messages constantly. It doesn't need to be subliminal because there's nothing legal or institutional preventing companies from putting those advertisements everywhere all the time. It's just like the psychology of once you start to look at it through the addiction lens is fascinating.
Yeah, and so it's the food environment is one aspect that makes food kind of, more difficult for people than even some drugs because of the nature of advertising being everywhere and food being in our face and the ease with which we can buy these food products and overeat them is a huge factor. I think and you've touched on one of the things that I think makes processed food more trouble for us than, say, cigarettes is memory, right? So we form memories for food starting at a really young age in adolescence when we're forming more memories of all kinds. And we tend to associate those memories that we have tasting food, drinking food, with other kind of emotions. And this is why the soda companies fight so hard for what they call pouring rights at ballparks, because they know if they can get their soda in the hands of a kid when he's, having the time of his lives with his mom or his dad, time of his life, that kid will forevermore associate that soda with that joyful moment with their parents. I mean, I had this personal experience when I was out at Kellogg's doing a story about
Hmm.
another
Pop
aspect
Tarts.
of their operation, and they took me into their R&D facility. And again, I happened to be looking at salt. But across the factory floor, this aroma wafted my way. And it turned out they were doing some experimenting with a new Pop-Tart. And it had messed up, and they were dumping vast amount of raw Pop-Tart dough into this bin. And that smell instantly took me back to my days as a latchkey kid in the Central Valley of California, where I would come home from grammar school, let myself in, and put my favorite strawberry Pop Tart in the toaster. I hadn't had a Pop Tart, guys, until, since that time. But the mere smell of it instantly took me back to those days because the Pop Tart never left my brain. It was there and it is there as this memory. And the food companies know that all they have to do, to trigger that memory and to sort of get a craving going, or certainly an appetite, is to show me their logo or show me a commercial or somehow just kind of inject, or in this case, just the mere smell of the product. So memory is incredibly powerful when it comes to food in ways that it isn't so powerful in other addictive substances.
I want to ask you a sort of, no pun intended, how the sausage is made question, because you mentioned being in the factory and in reading your books, like what did the process look like of investigating these things? I mean, these factories seem to sort of welcome you in, but you're doing some relatively damning research in some sense.
Well, I mean, look, on one level, you know, these products are pretty marvelous. And really deep down, and I think this is one of the things that gives the industry such a pass, is that we see these products as our friends. I mean, it's really hard to imagine, like a Black Lives Matter type march, against Doritos or Oreos. You kind of sense that they would get laughed at, right? Because again, and that's part of the whole sort of marketing playbook of these companies, which is to get us liking these products at a really early age and hoping that will last through our lives, which it typically does. So part of the kind of spending time with the scientists who engineer these products, I would find myself getting cravings for things like potato chips, just the way they're showing me or describing to me, the incredible science that goes into making these marvelous products that taste, some of them really terrific and can stay on the shelf forever and not cost very much money. So in some ways, it's like a little Willy Wonka factory when you go in these places, and it's like, gee whiz, how did you pull this off? And also, they will spend years just tinkering with a formula to get everything kind of to work properly. Um, so, so, so in some ways, and I think I was successful in getting key players inside the industry to talk to me for two reasons. One, I had the inside documents. I had their emails and their white papers where they're talking about their efforts to maximize the allure of their products and to get us to not just like them, but to want more and more of them. But then I think it just, being a journalist and having empathy with the people who invented these products, I was able to spend time with them and they opened up to me because, I think one of the biggest defenses, which is, I think to be largely true, is that they invented these products at a time when our dependence on them wasn't as great as it became. And to some extent, the problem of our over reliance on processed food is a matter of the marketing department and not the invention side. In fact, I would say, sometimes I think it's like 90% of the problem with processed food is the marketing and
Marketing.
the
Hmm.
advertising as opposed to the formulation.
That was something that definitely struck me reading both of the books was, I mean, a huge piece of this conversation has to just be like the role of capitalism in the whole problem. These are companies trying to make money. They've figured out what makes money. You mentioned in Hooked a little bit the lack of high quality, like placebo controlled, randomized controlled trials in the nutrition world. Like nutrition science in
Mm.
general isn't as good as it could be. But where we seem to be really good based on what you found is the psychology of food. We have like these companies, we humans run around talking about what we prefer and what we like. These are our stated preferences. We say we want healthy food, yada yada. But the companies are good at seeing straight past that to our revealed preferences, which are not
Mm.
what we say we want. They're the actual choices we make in the moment when we're presented with real life trade-offs. And it turns out we don't really necessarily want healthy food that much. We might say we want it, we might consciously or rationally want it, but when we're put in the situation and forced to make the choice with our own dollars, we want this engineered stuff that's super, super tasty and cheaper per calorie and all these things.
Yeah, and that goes back to, those basic instincts I was telling you about. I spent time with a wonderful scientist. She was at Yale and now she's up in McGill and in Montreal. She was the first person to figure out that if you could see the brain on food by sliding a patient into an fMRI, which doctors use to look for tumors and stuff, but scientists use to kind of study how the brain functions. Um, and because you can't move in the fMRI, it'll blur the data and the imagery. She being a self-professed chocoholic, name is Dana Small. She realized she could feed her subjects a little square of Lindt milk chocolate, and they could press it against the roof of their mouth and have it melt without their moving their heads at all. And the result would show up sort of in their brains, which was just kind of this marvelous, clever experiment. But Dana's being a big fan of Darwin. And again, you don't have to believe in evolution to kind of track this because this can even go back to the days of Adam and Eve too. But in Dana's view, it's not so much that these products are addictive, is that we by nature are drawn to food in very special ways. And in ways, in fact, that encourage us to overeat and put on lots of body fat, because for most of our existence, overeating and body fat was a really great thing because they
Mhm.
got us through the next drought and the famine. And so there's all kinds of aspects about our physical biology and mental state that lead us to want to overeat. But as Dana goes on to say, the problem is, as I mentioned before, is that the industry has so dramatically changed the nature of our food environment in the last 50 years that now overeating is an everyday thing. And we haven't had time to sort of develop the defenses to all the things they do to encourage us to overeat. And so just quickly, one of the very basic instincts we have about food is kind of cheapness. Back in hunter-gatherer days, we realized it made much more sense instead of trying to chase down an impala for dinner to simply reach down and grab that poor aardvark sitting there because it meant less energy expenditure on our part, which was what life was all about, kind of in that kind of environment. And so what do the food companies do? They have working for them flavor labs, mostly in New Jersey, whose job is to mix and match chemicals to mimic the real flavors in foods. But their overarching mission for the food giants is to find ways to reduce the cost of those ingredients because they know when we walk into the store and that box of breakfast pastries is 15 cents less this week, that will ignite a deep basic attraction, basic instinct of us that attracts us to cheap food.
Mm. So I'm going to get dangerously political with a question here. Um, you, I believe, did Mark Hyman's podcast back in 2018.
Ooh.
Um,
That's how
I
you guys met.
I personally believe that his motivations are generally pretty good. He's done a lot of good work. Most of the things he says are totally true. But I've noticed a little bit of a populist bent in his content lately. He's gotten very involved in the Make America Healthy Again movement. He's gotten much more active on social media. We connected somewhat accidentally. I was being kind of snarky on LinkedIn, as I tend to do sometimes, kind of calling out a Mark Hyman post where he was implicitly suggesting that like ice cream and chocolate syrup were healthy a few decades ago and then became unhealthy recently because of secret toxic ingredients. I'm curious about what you think. It doesn't have to be about Mark Hyman as a specific case study, but kind of what's going on with the whole Maha movement in general, because it seems like they've got some good ideas in there, but we're falling into the same trap as we have before, where we get focused on kind of distractions
Hmm.
and the industry just shifts to the next thing.
Yeah, that's the word I was going to use, actually, distractions. I don't think I've talked to Mark since that podcast. My sense is that the rhetoric coming out of RFK Jr. and Maha sounds so similar to Michelle Obama, but that he has surrounded himself by some people who are selling products that seem kind of problematical, and they by and large are using this like hyped up, exaggerated rhetoric based not on solid science, reaching for, silver bullets that, I even see the effort to get food dyes out of Fruit Loops and other things to be okay, but maybe a distraction from the larger picture, which is that it's probably the Fruit Loops themselves that's the bigger contributor to our health trouble than the food dyes or other additives. So yeah, I want to be hopeful on the words, but solving obesity and the other chronic diseases associated with processed food is a really complex thing that doesn't lend us to that kind of political environment, I don't think,
Hmm.
lend itself.
That kind of brings me to a topic that when I was preparing for this conversation, I saw as kind of a core one to discuss with you. We mentioned the word distractions there. You said earlier in our conversation, they try to get us not to focus on the real issues, and that's orbiting around this idea of permission.
Mm,
The and we've said that like there's a bigger issue with marketing than there is with actual nutrition, and these marketing folks are very good at making it feel okay. That's kind
mhm.
of what they're there to do. And as I read your stuff, it seems like this is a little bit of a moving target, right? Like scientists or the government or somebody will highlight a problem ingredient. And all the industry has to do is shift away from that ingredient. And doesn't mean the thing they're shifting to is healthy. It just means that that thing is a red light right now. So we need to find something that people have permission to consume. So for a little bit, saturated fats are bad. So we'll get away from saturated fats. What did we put in? Trans fats. Turns out trans fats worse than saturated fats. So what did we do? We keep on pivoting, and the target has moved so far that we now have, again, getting political, but like the Secretary of Health and Human Services is sitting down for an interview eating beef tallow fries,
Mhm.
giving permission to eat them. We've come full circle within just like a couple decades back to where we were because we're as each thing becomes the evil secret ingredient, that's fine. The industry is more than capable of pivoting just enough to give you permission.
Yeah, and you can kind of see that play out over the decades even. Like the 80s seemed there was a lot of concern about sugar back in the 80s. And you tended to see the companies, try to reduce the amount of sugars that they were using in products. But in doing so, again, with the bottom line being keeping the allure at maximum, they would increase some of their other ingredients, especially, fats and salt to maintain the tasting, the attractiveness of the products. The 90s maybe more about fats. You had a lot of people going like the non-fat route, and the companies played, willingly, gladly played along with that and just, pumped up the sugar and the salt to make up for the lack of mouthfeel, in their products. And then more recently, salt has kind of become the public enemy number one because of its, association with high blood pressure and heart disease. And that's when you, especially with older people, and that's kind of when you saw the industry, you know, putting forth products that claim to have kind of less, a little bit less salt anyway. And now you have, with maybe all of those three, ingredients on equal footing, last few years, you have the companies kind of trying to do something else to distract people from looking at the amounts of those ingredients in their products. It's kind of gotten harder to go into a grocery store and decide and figure out like what's good for me and what's not, because there's all this pretense better for you stuff going on in the store. I like to call it health washing, like we used to have with greenwashing when environmental concerns caused, companies to pretend to make their products more fine for the environment. And so, sort of, for example, protein is something of a darling with nutritionists because there's some sense that getting more protein in your diet can make you feel fuller faster, and so you'll eat less. Okay, maybe in some controlled circumstances. But what did you see? You then saw cereal makers, putting a couple extra grams of protein in their otherwise massively sugary cereal and splashing the word protein on the front of the box as a way of giving themselves a fake halo of health.
I love that you mentioned that because Michael Pollan is a guy that I've looked at for a long time around nutrition type stuff. And he uses this phrase, supermarket pastoral, I think in Omnivore's Dilemma, to explain exactly what you're talking about. You go into the supermarket and there's like a picture of a cow on the milk and and it sort of lures you into this false sense of safety. And what I wanted to ask you, speaking of Alex talking about pivots and permissions, is we've somewhat shifted towards organic and natural and these buzzwords that are trying to, I'll steal your word, kind of put a halo around
Mhm.
what otherwise might be still considered processed food. So I guess knowing what you know about the processed food industry, have we solved for some of that by shifting to organic, et cetera, or are we just making up words to get away from,
Hmm.
you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of factors that could go into your decision about what to eat. You could care about the farmer and farm workers and the environment and animal welfare. And when I think of organic foods, I'm mostly thinking that the farm workers who are growing that stuff for us are less exposed to pesticides than they would otherwise. As you know, as well as myself, but they're the ones getting the real heavy loads out in the farms. And so having an organic product will help fix that aspect of the food. But you can have an organic crappy junk food that's
Mhm.
going to cause you or potentially pose just as high a risk for chronic disease as the non-organic version because it's only and likewise with imitation meat products, they're going to be solving the animal welfare issue, but they may be filled with things that pose, as big a threat as meat,
Mhm.
based sort of products or processed foods.
Do you see a world where we sort of ban, and maybe ban is too strong of a word, but like I remember with cigarettes, you can't advertise cigarettes. You can't show someone drinking a beer in a commercial. Like we have all these constraints in place. And we've already talked about how marketing is such a huge force with processed foods. Do you see a world where that type of marketing gets banned to maybe protect
Yeah.
us?
Yeah, I think I do. And look, in an ideal world, I would rather see a world where we're able to market and advertise good stuff to eat, like stuff in the produce aisle. In fact, I did this crazy story for the New York Times Magazine a few years back where I got a because there's no advertising hardly done for the produce section. I got this agency that works for Big Food to do for me a pro bono, completely fictitious campaign to sell not any vegetable, but broccoli, arguably one of the tougher vegetables out there
Hmm.
for certainly people my age whose parents like cooked it into like brown mush. And it was the most, and not only that, but they got me to, they allowed me to videotape their kind of madman experience in creating this ad campaign. And you can kind of still see it on the New York Times website, but it was hilarious. But one of the first things they did was decide there is no way we're going to talked about broccoli being healthy for you, good for you, because the government has been doing that for decades and it hasn't influenced people's eating habits at all. We're going to go a different direction and have fun with broccoli. And it turned out to be a really great campaign. But in the real world, I don't see campaigns like that happening. And because marketing to kids is especially so influential. I mean,
Hmm.
you can go back all the way to 1980 when there were attempts to limit the amount of TV advertising to kids because they were by and large just getting flooded with sugary, junky products. And those efforts failed. And now with social media, you know, it seems like there's hardly any controls on the industry. So I guess if I was emperor for the day, I would look at controlling the marketing, certainly with kids, on the notion that they're much more vulnerable to believing advertising than adults are.
Hmm.
We should state up front that this podcast is sponsored by Big Broccoli.
Hmm.
They are bankrolling
I
everything we
knew
do
it.
here.
I
Yeah.
knew it.
No, it's true. It's yeah. Wow.
Um, I'm curious about because you got to go inside some of these factories, inside some of these labs, see the work being done. Some of the stuff you talked about with Monel specifically had me thinking about the balance of power between like industry, government, watchdog groups. It seems like enough money can ensure that you know things enough years before everybody else to like extract some competitive advantage from that. And that in the nutrition space in particular, that's a little bit troubling that like inside a lab where both like the government and industry is paying for access to these scientists to do their work for them, whoever has more money gets to know the answer first. Is that the impression you got? Because that's how it felt to me reading it.
Yeah, so Monell is this, privately funded kind of it's almost like a clubhouse for PhDs. Lots of scientists doing basic research on what attracts us to food and what we like and what we don't like and how, to get us to like more. And it's funded in some part by or was when I looked at it by the food industry. I ended up really respecting those scientists though, because they would come up with studies that bit the hand that fed them. And they were very, very independent minded when it came to these things. You can also though see that conflict between doing good by the public and making profits for your company within the companies themselves. I mean, one of the most fascinating companies is Nestle in Switzerland, at times the number one food company. They kind of jockey back and forth with PepsiCo. They have the most incredible research division of many PhDs working on basic science, with good intentions of coming up with products that have less of the harmful, additives in them while maintaining the allure. But you go down the road to the headquarters and one of their billionaire brands is the Hot Pocket, arguably a poster child for our overeating of highly convenient processed
And
processed
burning your
foods.
mouth.
Sorry,
and burning the shit out of your mouth.
when you pop them out of the microwave,
Yeah,
you gotta
the middle's ice cold
it's
and
that
the
craving you
outside,
got
yeah.
going, Drew. You gotta like control that.
Oh man. Can I ask, so obviously your first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat. Did you know going into this that those were the three things you were going to look at, or how did those three rise to the top?
No, well, kind of. So I had been writing about, as I mentioned, with those kebabs in northern Iraq, I've been writing about pathogens, E. coli
Hmm.
and stuff in food. And I was continuing to sort of do some stories on that when I one of my best sources who tests meat for E. coli said to me, Michael, for the industry, said to me, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination are, you really should look at things that this industry is intentionally adding to its products, over which it has total control. He was upset about all the salt going into processed meat. And so I did a story at the Times about the massive amounts of salt going into processed foods and how the industry is even more, you know, dependent on using salt for industrial reasons, not taste, than we are in liking and eating lots of salt. And then, I think the next thing I looked at maybe was oil and then sugar, and I had lunch with who would be my editor at Random House, and I was just kind of mentioning those three additives, and he goes, salt, sugar, fat. That'd make a good book title. Because he was like suggesting maybe I should write about like the beef industry or something, which I didn't want to do. But before I went too far, I went to a guy named Michael Jacobson, trained at MIT. He was head of this group called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, which I think does a fairly credible job. I mean, the food industry hates them, but I think they also respect them to some extent. And they actually look like pretty conservative straight shooters these days, given the environment in the White House. But I ran that by him and said, Michael, am I safe in focusing on these three additives, not as, from their nutritional aspect, but rather as weapons in the hands of these companies, given the fact that there's 5,000, I guess, additives, routinely added to processed food. And he thought I was on safe ground, again, given the fact that many of these other additives are used in such tiny amounts that by and large, the majority of them don't pose the kind of risk to us that salt, sugar, and fat do in those amounts used in these foods. And it's also, I mean, the one misgiving I have is that it doesn't reflect what may be one of the most problematic things about processed food, which is not the amount of salt, sugar, fat that it has, but the fact that it dominates our diet to exclude the other things we should be getting, like real nutritious fiber and
Hmm.
micronutrients and the stuff you get from vegetables. So sometimes I look at processed food, a particular item is not being bad in and of itself, but bad because it fills up my stomach and distracts me, there's that word again, from eating better for me things.
Do people ever mistake you for the Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat cookbook?
Well, that's a wonderful cookbook.
I love that book.
Yeah, no, it's really, really great. It's funny when the Salt Sugar Fat came out. I mean, it got sort of a huge amount of media attention right off the bat. I mean, I confess, I was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, a long excerpt. And then I confess I did a Dr. Oz show. He treated me really well and accurately. And then there were other media interviews all in that space. So it hit the number one spot for New York Times lists of bestsellers for all nonfiction. And it stayed in like the top 10 for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 weeks, which is kind of phenomenal for like an investigative book. And I kind of joked at the time that people mistakenly thought it was a diet book because it came out in February. And February is a great time for all the diet book hucksters out there who are selling us on these like silver bullet
Mm.
fake gurus because we've tried to lose weight in January and it didn't work. And now we're like desperately grasping for. So that was my own little private joke about maybe why salt, sugar, fat did so did so well.
When you hit bestseller for all books ever, always, is that like an email? How does that come across your desk?
Random House called because they knew they get the listings ahead of time,
Hmm.
and they had a big party.
Nice.
It was as fun as winning the Pulitzer Prize, I have to say. And it built a huge kind of momentum for the book. And so, I mean, I have done hundreds of media interviews as well as social media. And I continue to get calls from reporters around the world who, because this American, style processed food industry has marched around the world getting other
Hmm.
cultures, other countries with deep, ironically, with deep food cultures like France and Italy and Germany to become more and more dependent on their products. And so reporters there are looking for the whys and wherefores. And sultry, it's holding up over time. Unfortunately, not a lot has
It has
changed.
a long shelf life, you might say.
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, it's we should take some time now to congratulate you because you may have won the Pulitzer Prize before. You've been on CNN, New York Times, Daily Show, Dr. Oz, all these things. But now you've been on the important one. Now you've been on the Mops and Mo's podcast. So
You guys are, as smart as Jon Stewart can be, and fast. You guys are
He
fabulous.
takes his cues from us for sure.
Exactly, I'm sure.
Yeah.
so Drew mentioned this, I think, at the very beginning slash before we even hit record, about the hill we're going to die on or the hill we're going to kill our enemies on, whichever way you want it to be. You've talked about the kebabs in Iraq. You've talked about the chow hall in Fallujah. I want to cue you in. I don't know if you're still doing investigative journalism, but there's a story out there for whoever wants to chase it. And that is, and we'll include Iraq and Afghanistan in this to a certain degree when we were still like at a high level of occupation in those countries, not anymore, but more so at our military bases here in the United States, in Europe, places where we have large formations, like just a look at the nutrition environment on these bases because it's now dominated by some of the worst offenders in the fast food space. We have more service members eating at like Pizza Hut and Burger King and Charlie's than we do at the dining hall. And I think it has a little bit to do with some of the salt, sugar, fat phenomenon. It has a little bit to do with the psychology of it, the convenience of it. We we had an episode a couple weeks ago where we looked at the fact that for junior soldiers, we deduct several $100s from their paycheck every month and give them a meal card in return where they get to go to the chow hall and get their meals provided to them. So like it's not really free. We just force them to pay for it. They get no choice. They're going to pay that money no matter what. And yet those same soldiers who have already paid with their money for meals at the dining facility will still choose to spend what little is left of their disposable income on fast food and leave that meal they've already paid for uneaten. And I think that comes back to a lot of the things you looked at before.
Yeah, which really kind of blows my mind. And I've actually done a little reporting, and there is a conflict. I mean, there are people within the military who are fighting
Mhm.
for better food and ways to nudge and encourage, military personnel to eat better on the argument that, again, this can be a matter of life and death, and it just makes sense. But my understanding, they also run up against the procurement people who are all powerful in making those decisions about what gets on a base or not. But it does kind of blow my mind. And on the other side, though, too, I mentioned if I was emperor for a day, there may be 10 things you could do. But I mean, I think I would actually want to start with the military environment because it's such a perfect place to experiment. I mean, you've
Mhm.
got men and women there captive, right? And you've got them for 4 years or whatever. You can kind of do whatever you want and come up with a great education program that doesn't preach health to them, but more talks about food in terms of its political aspect and then provide good food, to them and let them see the results. they can then go out and be ambassadors to, all those elementary schools where the military is, going to want to be recruiting people, kids by the time they get to high school, to try to sort of change things at that level too, because that is so difficult. So many kids in recruitment areas are just not fit for service. So ironically, the military is getting hit really hard, but it also, I think, could be a really opportune place to run some fabulous experiments that would then spill over to civilian society as well.
Think
Mm.
we're trying to do that to a certain degree. I mean, this podcast exists to talk about all the military human performance efforts that are going on. A lot of people do care about it, but it sometimes feels like those of us who care about it have to fight our own organization to make it happen. Like you would think that the military would be the perfect place to do central planning perfectly.
Mhm.
You have a literal commander of the installation that can just decide things unilaterally, doesn't have to be put to a vote. The policies are straightforward, they're black and white. And yet like we suck at public transportation on military bases. We like don't lay them out properly. Like things become unwalkable. Like all the same problems that you see outside military bases, you see on military bases. So we're clearly not doing a great job taking advantage of the ability to do those things.
But I think I've heard that you have an incredible education system.
Mm.
Maybe
It's
Ish.
compared overall to American, civilian education.
Well,
I
the
don't.
problem, I mean, and again, we keep talking about this hill we're going to die on. Like I mentioned, both Alex and I work in this embedded performance space, which is relatively new. And effectively,
Mhm.
what you have are, senior leaders, branches of the military investing in health, wellness, human performance. But you have this other conflicting interest situation of the incentive structure around food availability on base,
Right.
choice architecture, not even getting into the, getting paid to be disabled once you're with the VA and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting dichotomy that we're dealing with. So the education piece is there, but the environment surrounding that is not always conducive to the outcomes you would hope you would achieve.
I'll clarify a piece too, because I think when Drew and I hear education, we think education for the service members. And I think what Michael's talking about is like the DODEA schools, the Department of Defense Education Activity. And they do seem, this is not an area of expertise for me. I Googled it while you guys were talking, but they're scoring like significantly higher than basically every state's public school system. So I think that is a pretty decent example. We certainly have problems. They're not perfect, but there does seem to be some positive trends taking place there.
Right.
Mm.
And maybe there's some lessons to be drawn from like, how did they do that? And again, maybe they don't have sort of the economics and the finances that you have with kind of food procurement and supply and the food industry sort of pushing to put their products on base. I mean, that's what you're up against too. It's the same on the
Mm.
civilian side that you wouldn't have kind of in the schools too. But there might be some lessons learned from the education side, folks who did so well.
So speaking of lessons learned, I wanted to ask you because Salt, Sugar, Fat came out in 2013, Hooked came out 2021, and so you've sort of been involved in this for now over a decade. And it's interesting to me because in 2013, I mean, that was a bestseller. Clearly, there was a lot of interest in this, but here we are 12 years later, still kind of having the same conversation. So have you seen a positive shift, a negative shift, no shift at all? Like where are we headed with all this?
Well, certainly more and more people care and think about what they put in their mouths and put in their bodies and the consequences. When you see that happening, but you maybe see a growing divide between people who can afford to shop for food that's good for them and folks who don't, who live in these food swamps. I give a talk to the Hospital Association in Kansas, where some folks were trying to get better food into the hospital because there's a truism in the medical system that they'll save you in the emergency room and then kill you in the
Yeah.
ward. But actually, what's going on with food is that there's this huge lost opportunity to sort of help patients understand the connection between good eating and their health outcomes. And many doctors are kind of frustrated by that. But when I was giving this talk, this woman stood, raised her hand, and she said, Michael, you have to realize that, you know, I have to drive 90 minutes to reach my only source of fresh vegetables, which is a Walmart. And so I can only afford that tank of gas, once a week. And so, most of my grocery cart by design, fills up with shelf-stable products that will last until the next time I can go there, which is, really really, really illuminating. So yeah, if you live in Berkeley or you live in Brooklyn, like I do, you have access to incredible farm markets with locally raised great food. But for so much of the country, financially strapped, not to mention availability, it's still really difficult. I mean, you walk in the store, well-meaning by you and your family, and you realize that a basket of blueberries, especially kind of off season or shoulder season, is going to cost as much as a 2 pound, four meat, three cheese frozen pizza that's going to feed the whole family. And
Mm.
with a limited budget, what are you going to do? So, one of those 10 things I would want to do as emperor would be to kind of look at the dynamics of our agricultural system, where 90% of the farmland is going to field corn and soybeans for processed food. And the 10% is for everything else that, the vegetables and nuts and stuff and fruits we should be eating more of. And so something has to be done to make it easier and more affordable for people to eat. And that's a real difficult thing. It's
Hmm.
a challenge.
So we're getting towards an hour here. I have a kind of hard pivot question that I feel like I need to ask you just to check. You don't just focus on the food industry, but it seems to be something that a lot of people have come back to you for a lot over time because of the popularity of these books. But you've covered corporate interests in nursing homes, you've covered issues with body armor for service members in Iraq. Do you ever get tired of being like the food guy? And what topics would you focus on if you had the freedom to choose?
Yeah, I've looked at doing some other things recently, and I haven't come across something that is kind of so meaningful and so important to so many people. So in a way, as a journalist, I kind of got spoiled by torturing the processed food industry because they seem to kind of deserve it more than any other kind of big industry. I think when I do something else, and I'm working on some sort of Hollywood versions of what I've been writing. So that's kind of my creative challenge that's going on. But yeah, I mean, I think if I did something else at this point, it'd probably be like a crime novel or something totally different.
Nice.
Okay, before we let you go, this is one that we ask a lot of our folks, and I think you're perfectly positioned to answer it. It's two-parter. One thing you've changed your mind on, and this can be specific to the processed food industry for the purposes of this conversation. So one thing you've changed your mind on, one thing you've doubled down on.
Ooh, those are great. Those are great questions. Well, I went into this thinking, okay, true confession. I would look at somebody who's overweight and I would go, come on,
Mm.
just a little more exercise, executive function. And I've completely and embarrassingly acknowledged that wrong-headedness because these products, as I especially learned in the second book, are engineered to destroy your free will and your ability to kind of control them. And it's not people's fault. And then something I've doubled on down on, like the industry doubles down in response to, people's concerns about bad, health. Yeah, I think I've doubled down on the conviction that these are companies doing what companies will do, and whatever solution we come up with, I think will inherently lie not in kind of government intervention directly anyway, but in somehow convincing these companies that they can make as much money, selling products that are good for us,
Mm.
are yummy, convenient, low cost, but also good for us, and I have to be, and that they would be willing to do that if they can just kind of execute that, and maybe they need just some more nudging to do that.
Perfect. Well, you are far too qualified to be spending an hour talking to us. So thank you, sir, for your time. Thank you for coming on. We appreciate it.
Oh, this is really great. Thank you for your work. It's so important.
Thank you. Team, welcome to the tail end of our conversation with Michael Moss. I'm going to be honest with you. I know I showed you before we started that I had eaten a Cadbury cream egg. That was actually my third of the evening. So when we talk about processed foods and bliss points and marketing and people being suckers for all that, I mean, I like to say that I was unwillingly tricked into purchasing those things, but holy shit, when Easter comes around, do I eat a ton of Cadbury cream eggs. So, but in all seriousness,
is that an addiction that you have to Cadbury cream eggs? Is it a lack of willpower?
It's an addiction, but like, I don't know what you would call like what's a willful, like I knowingly am doing this to myself.
So that I talk about addiction a lot at work, actually, in a weird way. We talk about it in relation to like cell phones and sleep and like the influence between those things. And my working definition of addiction is when you continue a behavior when it meets two criteria. One, you know it's bad for you. And two, you don't want to do it.
And that's absolutely an addiction. Wait, no, I do want to do it.
That's the thing. You do want to do it. So I don't think you're quite into addiction territory yet.
Perfect. So it's healthy.
I don't know about that.
Well, it's, yeah. Newsflash, Cadbury cream eggs are not eggs. There's no egg. There's nothing. Yeah. Okay. Let's get down to brass tacks. Michael Moss had no business talking to us.
No.
But
wildly overqualified for this platform.
Supremely overqualified. However, everybody should go out and read both of those two books because they're fascinating. And if you haven't gone down sort of the rabbit hole of what should we call it, the processed foods genre. I know we've talked about Michael Pollan a couple of times here, Michael Moss obviously as well, but a fascinating landscape, just the ways in which these companies manipulate things and market things and intentionally go about positioning things so that you as the consumer have to like actively try not to eat like ass is mind-blowing. I mean, one of the things that I always think about is going into the grocery store for basics like eggs, milk, real eggs, not cream eggs, but like milk, eggs. You got to go through the milieu of processed bullshit to even get there. And that's like, so again, I know a lot of people probably realize this, but it's crazy to me that that's kind of the world that we live in at large, not just in the military, but even more so maybe in the military setting, because like he mentioned, we almost have more control and we choose not to exert it. When it comes to choice architecture and the food environment that we're existing in. So you could go down a ton of rabbit holes, but I'll leave it with that. Yeah.
My only real takeaways here, like, yes, absolutely. Go read the books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked. Both had a ton of insightful stuff that I've already referenced it at work since even reading the books before even having this conversation. I'm just still rattled by like the fact that I just got compared to Jon Stewart as an interviewer. I'm processing that a little bit. I mean, this guy, like, you're supposed to go through like the Harry Walker agency to book this guy to speak. He's spoken at like some of the highest levels, some huge events, invited by some of the biggest companies. He's been on the Daily Show. It's just super cool that he stays this accessible.
Yes.
And
power of LinkedIn.
Probably, yeah, I was going to say probably the worst takeaway of this whole thing is that the universe continues to send me messages that I should keep on
being an asshole on the internet,
being an asshole on LinkedIn, because it has consistently led to good things, like across the board. Like, I don't know why. I just do a little instigating and all of a sudden something good happens. I don't know what it is. I'm trying to stop doing it, but the universe is telling me keep on going.
Well, I'll give a little plug here then for our website and our contact form. I know we've mentioned this to folks many times, as I think any good business should, but Alex and I love talking to people. That's why we do
Mhm.
this. We love talking to people like Michael, who, like we mentioned, we have no business talking to, but who can provide a very interesting perspective to listeners. And I know from engaging with a lot of you, universal you, listeners, you, people like listening to our conversations with non-military types. And so if there are authors you like, if there are, I don't know, I'll throw politicians in there, just anybody that you like and you want to hear about, both Alex and I are dumb enough to want to reach out and just blatantly ask them to come on to the Mops and Mo's podcast. So feel free to hit us up, give us some recommendations. Bear in mind, rule number one of the podcast is if you ask to come on, you cannot come on. But there are workarounds. People have found workarounds. But if there's somebody that you want us to talk to, maybe not like up at like the presidential level, we haven't figured out how to access that one. But below that, we can find ways to make it work, hopefully.
And even better if you have access to the person somehow.
Even better.
Right? Like that certainly greases the gears a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The number of times I've received messages about bringing like obvious famous characters onto the podcast, like cool, but unless I have an in, I can't get that person. And I'll also just underline what Drew said about like contacting us through the website. Until a few months ago, I don't know how many months ago, I read, and to some degree, even if it was just an emoji, responded to every
I saw this
message
on Instagram
on the
story.
Instagram page.
I'm proud of you for this.
Last few months, I have not been doing that. Not even close. Not even half. Probably not a quarter. So I'm like a little bit sorry, but I'm also not sorry at all because it's much, much better for my mental health.
Can I just pause you there, just so people are aware of how bad this problem was? We would be recording episodes and you'd be responding to Instagram comments.
That didn't happen very often. I'm
Very
sure it
often
happened once
is
or
carrying
twice.
a lot of water, but the point, yeah, it happened. So Alex is a healthier person now because of you folks out there choosing to use the contact form instead of the DMs.
Yeah. So that's all. Like you might get a response on a DM, maybe. It just depends on the day and what's going on and the timing.
Get a response when you email us. So
yep.
I think that closes us out. Team.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Yep. See you next week. Eat healthy this week and avoid processed foods. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsandmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.